She opened her eyes in silence, realizing not even the wrinkles on her hands felt like they belonged to her anymore. The giant dog beside her didn't bark, didn't move, it just watched her like it had been waiting forever. Then it walked away without a sound, and something deep inside her whispered, if she followed, everything would change. In the town she didn't recognize, a stranger fell to his knees, crying, "You saved me, you don't remember?" Another voice from the shadows growled, "She vanished because of you," and her bones screamed with a truth too close. But the worst came when her best friend smiled, and confessed he's the one who stole her past forever. Now she's remembering, and someone out there will do anything to stop her. Harold, the once trusted handyman and Mabel's longtime companion, couldn't yet know that the lies he whispered would soon start to unravel. Elliot, the quiet boy from the pantry turned city reformer, had no idea that the folder Charlie hid still held the truth. And Mabel, forgotten by time but remembered by everyone else, certainly had no idea that they'd all been connected by the same betrayal. It all started with the sound of wind rustling through the old lace curtains, the kind that hang heavy with memories and dust, whispering stories to the hardwood floor as the morning sun spilled quietly into a house no longer sure of its purpose. The house was old, older than the woman lying inside it, and in many ways, it had become just as forgetful, creaking at odd moments, groaning in the cold, forgetting which floorboard used to sing under her step and which one always stayed silent. Mabel, though she herself no longer remembered that was her name, woke up as she always did these days, to the silence of her own breath and the steady gaze of a dog that seemed to remember far more than she could. The dog, a towering old German shepherd with a gray-muzzled face and eyes full of fierce patience, sat perfectly still at the edge of her bed, not barking, not whining, just watching her like he was waiting for a signal she hadn't yet learned how to give. There was no alarm clock in the room, no television murmuring in the background, no family bustling in the kitchen making coffee, just the sound of her trying to piece together the shapes of furniture she should have known and the name of the dog whose loyalty she did not deserve but still had. She sat up slowly, feeling the ache in her bones that had become the only part of her that showed up on time every single morning, and she looked at the dog, then at the window, then at her own hands, which trembled just slightly, as though they, too, were unsure what came next. There had once been a time when her hands baked pies, planted gardens, held children, drove cars down long back roads, and turned the pages of library books with purpose, but now they only searched, groping through memory like it was a fog she hadn't asked to walk through. Then came the twist, one so small and gentle you wouldn't even notice it if you weren't listening with your whole soul. The dog stood up, turned, and walked toward the front door without ever once looking back to see if she'd follow. And for some reason she couldn't name, she did. She followed him down the hallway that smelled faintly of old cedar and lemon oil, past the photo frames turned backward on the wall, faces hidden from her by hands that feared what forgetting them might feel like, and out into the morning air, which still held the cool of a night not quite finished. The dog led her down the porch steps, across the gravel drive, and into the slow hush of a sleepy town that seemed surprised to see her walking again, as if the whole place had settled into the idea that she'd never leave her home again, let alone be led somewhere by a shepherd with a secret. They walked in silence, her slippers barely lifting off the sidewalk, until they reached a little shop at the edge of town, its sign faded by the sun but still proud enough to tell you it had once meant something, a blacksmith's forge, long cold now, with windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. Inside was a man with arms like rope and a face carved out of time itself, who dropped the horseshoe he'd been holding the second he saw her shadow pass through the door, and in a voice too steady for someone whose eyes had just welled up, said, "Well, I'll be damned, you really came back, Mabel." She blinked, confused, her mouth trying out the name like a stranger at her own doorstep, and before she could ask what he meant, he stepped forward slowly and whispered, "You don't remember the fire, do you?" Her lips parted, but no sound came, only the image, flickering and fleeting, of flames licking up wallpaper and someone's hand reaching through smoke. And just before the screen fades to black and we drift toward part 2, the old man, trembling now with something far older than fear, asks, "Do you remember what you did for me that night, Mabel?" The blacksmith's voice, though thick with years and softened by time, held something in it that couldn't be mistaken for anything but awe, the kind of reverence a man keeps locked away for saints, war heroes, and women who once pulled him out of a burning building with nothing but a will that wouldn't take no for an answer. "No," she said softly, the word fragile on her lips like an autumn leaf about to fall. "I don't remember, not yet." He nodded, more to himself than to her, then reached beneath the counter with hands that still bore the calluses of honest labor and placed a scorched metal horseshoe on the counter like it was the crown jewel of some lost kingdom. "You saved me," he said, his voice cracking just enough to let the truth shine through the weathered layers, "when the forge caught fire in the middle of that storm, and the wind blew the flames faster than I could think." He paused, eyes wet now, not with fear, but with the weight of a memory carried too long alone. "You kicked in the side door, crawled through smoke thick as tar, found me under that damn beam, and dragged me out. I begged you to leave me, but you wouldn't." Mabel stared at the horseshoe, trying to imagine herself doing such a thing, her hands still trembling in her lap like they remembered being strong, but weren't quite sure how anymore. "I didn't have anyone left," the blacksmith continued, his voice steadier now, like a man setting down a burden he'd carried far too long, "and you came back for me, even when no one else did." There was a long silence between them then, the kind that grows roots, heavy, sacred, and meant to be felt more than filled, and in that silence, Mabel leaned forward slightly, the edges of something fluttering just beneath the surface of her mind. She could almost hear the fire again, not the roar of it, but the panic in someone's voice, her own maybe, and a sharp pain in her shoulder where something heavy had once fallen, and then, the sound of rain, blessed and cold, washing ash off her skin. "You've always been that kind of woman," the blacksmith said gently, lifting the scorched horseshoe and handing it to her like a relic, "brave even when you were scared, strong even when you had no reason left to be." She looked down at the horseshoe, its shape twisted by flame but still whole, and a strange warmth began to stir inside her, not memory, not yet, but something deeper, older, maybe soul. The dog, still silent, still watchful, stood at the door now, ears pricked, eyes locked on the path ahead, like he knew this was only the first of many such reckonings still to come. Mabel turned back to the blacksmith, her voice steadier than before, though still unsure of what she was reaching for. "Why did I come back?" she asked, her tone not curious, but searching, like she was trying to understand the woman everyone else seemed to know but her. The blacksmith stepped around the counter, walked slowly over to her, and took her hand in his as if they were about to step into a memory together. "Because you weren't done," he said, "and someone out there still needs to remember what you did before it's too late." Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of rain and old leaves, and as Mabel turned toward the open door once more, the blacksmith called after her, not to stop her, but to remind her. "You should visit the boy at the lake next," he said, "he never stopped asking if you'd come back." And without a word, the dog turned down the road again, each step steady, each path chosen with a purpose Mabel still didn't understand, but somehow trusted with her life. As they walked, she glanced sideways at the shepherd, her voice thoughtful now, touched by something that felt like wonder. "Why does he remember more about me than I do?" And from just up ahead, near the edge of the trees, came a voice, calm, young, but cracked with emotion. "Because he saw you do something I'll never forget." The voice came from the shadows of the trees, soft but unmistakably rooted in the voice of a grown man who once cried by a lake and never thought anyone heard him. Mabel paused, her eyes narrowing not with fear, but with that quiet curiosity of a soul trying to find its own reflection in someone else's memory. She turned, slowly, as though the very air around her had thickened with something sacred, and saw a tall figure step out from under the boughs, lean, sun-touched, with a bald cap in his hand and a boyish slouch he couldn't quite outgrow. "I was 12, he said, his voice cracking on the number like it still surprised him how young that really was, "and I'd already decided the world was a place that didn't need me in it." Mabel blinked slowly, as though each word he spoke was carving a fresh line into a diary she hadn't opened in years, not because she didn't want to, but because some stories felt too heavy to hold until someone else offered to carry them with you. "I'd been down by the lake every afternoon for weeks," he continued, stepping closer now, each word stitched tight with memory, "sitting on that same old dock with my legs dangling over the edge, trying to work up the nerve to let go. The wind shifted through the trees behind him, not loud, not cruel, just there, like the breath of a world that had been watching quietly all along. "And you," he said, his eyes now fixed on hers like two anchors in a sea of years, "you sat down beside me one day without saying a word, just handed me a peanut butter sandwich and looked out over the water like you'd done it 1,000 times before." Mabel's brow furrowed, but something inside her stirred, a familiar scent, maybe, or the sound of lake water brushing against worn wood, and it echoed faintly through the back halls of her mind like a tune half-remembered from childhood. "You didn't tell me not to do it," he said, his voice quieter now, like the moment deserved soft hands and slower breathing. "You just told me about a dog you used to have, the one that followed you home from the war." Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time since the journey began, she saw the shadow of her younger self, not clearly, not fully, but enough to remember that yes, there had been another dog, long before this one. "You said he never left your side," the man whispered now, barely audible over the sound of his own memory, "even when everyone else did, and then you looked at me and said, 'Sometimes, son, the trick is just to wait long enough for the right soul to find you.'" Mabel took a slow, trembling breath, not because of the chill in the air, but because some words have a way of unlocking doors no key could ever touch. "I went home that night," the man said, "and the next day I came back, not to jump, but to wait, and sure enough, a year later, I found someone who sat beside me and made the waiting worth it." He stepped forward then, placing something in her hand, a small, smooth stone painted with the word "stay" in soft blue letters, worn at the edges but whole. "I painted this the day after you left town," he said, "and I've kept it with me ever since, just in case you forgot how much you changed everything." Her fingers closed around the stone slowly, as if her hands remembered things her mind still struggled to catch up with, and she nodded, not because she fully understood, but because her heart did. Behind her, the dog stirred, lifting its head as if sensing it was time to move again, as though the next piece of the puzzle had been placed, and the picture was beginning to form, one remembered act of kindness at a time. As she turned to leave, the man called out, not with sorrow, but with the kind of deep gratitude that turns into legacy when passed from one soul to another. "Do you remember the woman in the red coat?" he asked, his eyes dark now with something unsaid, "the one who used to walk with you every Thursday?" And Mabel, pausing at the edge of the path, answered softly, not with words, but with a question that curled around both their hearts like smoke from an old fire. Was she the one, who never came back? Yes, the voice came from behind the garden wall, slow, brittle, carrying the weight of decades in a single syllable, as if speaking her name aloud might call back a ghost or wake a grief that never really went to sleep. The woman in the red coat had once walked with Mabel every Thursday morning, rain or shine, pushing past aching knees and creaky hips just to make it to that corner bench outside the bakery, where two old friends would split a cinnamon roll and watch the town come alive. Her name was Lillian, though everyone in town called her Lily, not because she was delicate, she most certainly wasn't, but because she bloomed late in life, loud and bold, like a wildflower growing out of concrete when no one expected it. "I used to think she was your sister," the voice said again, and this time Mabel turned to see an older woman, stooped and soft-eyed, standing by a gate covered in ivy, holding a watering can like it was armor against what might come next. "She wasn't my sister," Mabel replied, her voice hesitant but firm, like a woman tracing the edge of a memory she wasn't sure she should touch, "but we shared something deeper than blood." The older woman nodded, stepping aside to let Mabel through the gate, and suddenly the garden opened before them, not just a patch of flowers, but a living museum of scent and color, each bloom planted with intention, each path winding gently like a story told slowly, lovingly, and often. "She used to come here every Friday," the woman said, motioning toward a wooden bench painted bright yellow beneath an arbor of climbing roses, always in that same coat, even when it was too hot or too cold for it, said it made her feel remembered. Mabel moved toward the bench like it called to her, and as she sat, something in her posture changed, not just physically, but soul deep, like the weight of forgetting had loosened its grip, just for a moment, in this quiet space where nothing had been taken away yet. "She disappeared one winter," the gardener said, her voice trembling now with the first real crack of pain, "just never showed up one Thursday, and the whole town whispered about hospitals, retirement homes, or maybe family she never talked about. Mabel stared at the place where Lily used to sit, the groove in the wood still there, the air still faintly tinged with lilac and something sweet, and a flicker of warmth surged in her chest, not quite a memory, but the echo of one. I never believed she left on her own, the gardener continued, kneeling by a bed of violets and digging her fingers into the earth like it might answer her, not without telling you, and not without saying goodbye. Mabel looked down, noticing something tucked beneath the bench, a folded piece of red cloth, sun-faded but unmistakable, and as her fingers brushed against it, a vision burst across her mind so suddenly, so vividly, it took her breath away. She saw Lily, standing by the water's edge, coat billowing like a flag, voice rising in laughter as she pointed at something Mabel had said, then a hand, not Mabel's, reaching out to touch her shoulder, gently, and a second later, Lily was gone. The flash ended as quickly as it began, and Mabel sat still, her hands trembling around the fabric, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak a name she wasn't quite ready to say. Someone came for her, she whispered finally, someone I trusted, someone we both did. The gardener's face paled at that, and her next words came slowly, each one chosen like a stepping stone over deep, cold water. Do you think that person is still watching you now? She asked. And from the gate, where the dog waited silently with his eyes fixed on the path ahead, came a deep, low growl, not loud, not angry, just enough to say, yes, someone was. Yes, Mabel said, slowly and without fear, her voice no longer lost in fog but rising with the quiet conviction of someone who's beginning to hear their own soul again after too long in silence. She stood, her fingers still wrapped gently around the faded cloth from Lily's coat, and looked not at the gardener but at the dog, who had taken 2 steps closer and was now staring at the far end of the path as though it led somewhere only he remembered. There was a certain kind of silence in that moment, not empty, not ominous, but charged, like the air right before a thunderstorm, where everything seems to hold its breath waiting for the next sound to matter more than the last. They left the garden slowly, with Mabel walking a little taller than she had before, not because she felt stronger, but because she finally knew there was something worth walking toward. As they moved beyond the edge of town, the sky darkened slightly with thick clouds rolling in from the west, and the smell of coming rain settled around them like a blanket someone had just pulled from an attic chest. The dog turned onto a narrow dirt road that curved gently past the old community theater, its marquee letters cracked and faded, but still spelling out the same show it had promised for over a decade, tomorrow's dreams, today's courage. Inside, the stage was dark, the air thick with dust and echoes, the kind of place that remembers people longer than people remember themselves, and in the center of the stage stood a man who looked like he'd never left. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with gray in his beard and a sadness in his eyes that no makeup could ever cover. Mabel, he said, not with surprise, but with a kind of reverence that sounded like he'd been waiting for this moment for longer than he wanted to admit, I didn't think you'd remember this place. Mabel stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her eyes scanning the old velvet curtains and broken spotlights, and something deep inside her stirred, not quite memory, not yet, but the strong heartbeat of something lost and waiting to be found. I remember light, she said, and music, and laughter so loud it rattled the rafters. The man nodded, stepping down from the stage with the grace of someone who'd rehearsed such a movement 1,000 times, each one a little slower than the last. You ran the children's troupe, he said gently, every summer like clockwork. You taught kids how to speak louder than their fear, how to stand when their legs wanted to run. She touched the back of a seat, the fabric worn thin beneath her fingers, and a vision rose like mist, small hands holding scripts, bare feet slapping backstage floors, a child crying before curtain and her voice whispering, "You've got this." I was one of those kids, the man said, his voice cracking now with something older than gratitude, and I would have quit 100 times if you hadn't stood in that corner every night, mouthing the words along with us. Mabel closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of old wood and stage paint, and for a second, just 1 second, she remembered the shape of her own voice rising above a room full of chaos and becoming something solid, something real. But not everyone loved what you did here, the man added quietly, and the room seemed to darken just slightly, like a shadow had passed across the sun. She turned to him then, eyes sharper, and asked the question not as a woman chasing memories, but as someone who finally wanted the truth. What do you mean, not everyone? He hesitated, the silence between them thick with unspoken things, and then he walked slowly toward the front row and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping from the side pocket of an old prop chest. It was yellowed with time, the ink faded but still legible, Community Youth Program under scrutiny, concerns raised over funding, oversight. You had enemies, Mabel, he said softly, laying the paper in her hands like a wound that had never fully healed, not loud ones, but quiet, patient, polite, the kind that smile while they move your chair an inch closer to the edge. And as she stared at the paper, her pulse quickening with the old heat of injustice and something that felt dangerously like betrayal, she whispered. Who gave them the reason to come after me? From the wings of the stage, where the dog now stood completely still, came another voice, smooth, calm, and far too familiar. I believe, that would be me. The voice slid out from the wings like smoke from a cold chimney, slow, deliberate, and far too composed for a man confessing something so cruel. Mabel turned, her hands still clutched around the newspaper clipping like it might crumble if she loosened her grip, and from behind the curtain stepped a man she knew, or thought she had known, for longer than she dared to admit. He wasn't dressed like a villain, no sharp suit, no smirk, no shadow dancing behind him, just an old corduroy jacket, a crooked smile, and that same damn hat he'd worn the first time she'd let him carry her groceries home from the market. Harold, she said, the name tumbling out of her mouth with the hollow sound of a drawer opening to find the thing you hoped you'd lost forever. He nodded, as if the moment needed confirmation, and walked toward her with the careful steps of someone who wasn't sure if this was a funeral or a reunion. I never meant for it to go that far, he said, folding his hands in front of him like a schoolboy rehearsing an apology he didn't quite believe in, but they came to me, asked questions, and I answered them. Mabel stared at him, the man who used to fix her screen door, water her begonias when her knees gave out, sit with her on stormy nights when thunder reminded her of things she didn't want to recall. You answered them, she repeated, not with disbelief, but with the slow chill of betrayal sinking bone deep, knowing it would shut the program down, knowing those children would lose everything we built. His face twitched, just once, the kind of crack that shows up when guilt finally slips through pride, and he took another step, but the dog let out a low growl that stopped him cold. They promised funding, he said, his voice breaking now under the weight of years he couldn't rewind. They told me if I gave them names, if I painted the right picture, they'd replace you, upgrade the whole thing, but they never did, Mabel, they never replaced you. Her breath hitched, not from sadness, but from the ache of understanding, that kind of ache that only comes when the person you leaned on turns out to be the reason you fell. You said you were my friend, she whispered, her voice so quiet it almost disappeared, you said you'd always stand by me. He looked away then, toward the back of the theater, as if the truth might be hiding somewhere in the dark, waiting to rescue him from his own cowardice. I told myself I was protecting you, he said, more to the silence than to her, but the truth is, I was afraid of how much you mattered, to them, to the town, to me. Mabel stood a little taller then, the paper falling from her hand to the stage floor like a verdict she no longer needed to carry. And just when the weight of the moment threatened to crush what was left of her trust in people, the man from the audience, the one who'd once been her student, stepped forward and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. She gave you everything, he said quietly, not with anger but with the dignity of a man speaking for those too young to defend themselves, and you sold it for a lie. Harold didn't respond, perhaps because there was nothing left to say, and as Mabel turned to leave, she paused by the side exit, where the old dog waited, eyes forward as always, like he'd known Harold's part in this long before she ever remembered. And just before she stepped back into the rain, she asked, not to Harold, but to the boy who had grown into a man right in front of her. Do you know if the girl from the boarding house is still alive? From the shadows beneath the balcony, where no one had noticed her before, came the voice of an elderly woman, soft, tired, and laced with secrets too heavy for sleep. She is, she said, but she's been waiting for you to remember why she left. The woman's voice echoed just slightly in the hollow space of the theater, not because it was loud, but because it carried something heavier than sound, the weight of long-kept truth, and the sting of something left unsaid for far too long. Mabel turned slowly, the old wood creaking beneath her feet, as though the building itself recognized the gravity of what was coming and chose to speak in soft groans instead of words. There, in the dimness under the balcony, stood a figure half lost in shadow, hunched, shawled, and leaning gently on a cane, her presence quiet yet unmistakable, like the distant melody of a song you thought was only a dream. You always saw more than the rest of us, the figure continued, stepping slowly into the light, her eyes deep wells of tired wisdom, but sometimes, Mabel, sometimes seeing more means bearing more, too. Mabel's breath caught, not in fear, but in the overwhelming realization that the woman before her was no stranger, not truly, though her face had changed with time, her spirit still burned with that same gentle intensity that once made every child in the boarding house feel safe just by being near her. Clara, Mabel whispered, the name returning like a prayer, slow and reverent, as if she were speaking to the ghost of her own youth. I thought you'd left town, disappeared without a word. Clara's mouth turned up in the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, but offered just enough warmth to remind Mabel of summer nights spent rocking on a front porch, sharing secrets beneath the hum of crickets and the rustle of old quilts. I didn't leave, she said, her hand tightening slightly on the cane. I was pushed. Mabel's heart thudded, not from surprise, but from the sickening feeling that she'd heard that tone before, too many years ago, in a whisper behind closed doors and in the silences that stretched too long after certain questions were asked. Harold, Clara said, her voice hardening like steel hammered under grief, he came to me not long after your program began to grow, asked questions, made suggestions, and hinted at things I should be concerned about. Mabel closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her hand to her chest as if trying to hold her heart in place, not because of what she'd heard, but because of what she already knew deep down. He said you were spreading yourself too thin, Clara continued, her words slow and deliberate like a woman testifying after decades of silence, that the children were too much for you, that your health was suffering, and the town was starting to talk. And you believed him? Mabel asked, not with anger, but with the soft ache of a woman who had once trusted her own people more than they had trusted her. Clara took another step closer, the cane tapping against the floor like a metronome counting down the last beats of some old, unfinished song. No, she said, her eyes now locked on Mabel's, but I believed you would never ask for help, and I was right. There it was, the twist, sharp and sudden, not in what had been done, but in what had been left undone, the kindness withheld, not out of cruelty, but from the mistaken belief that silence could be protection. I left because I thought my absence would be the only thing that would make you stop and ask for help, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly now, but I was wrong, and by the time I realized it, Harold had already filled the cracks I left behind. Mabel sank onto the edge of the stage, the weight of the truth folding her into herself like a letter written in a hand she used to know. And for a long time, neither of them spoke, because there are some sorrows that don't need to be spoken aloud to be shared, they simply sit beside you, quiet and loyal, until you're ready to carry them together. Finally, Mabel looked up, her voice ragged but steady. Do you remember the boy who used to hide behind the pantry door during storms? She asked. Clara nodded once, her eyes suddenly shimmering with something dangerously close to tears. Yes, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, but you're not going to like what he became. The words fell like a slow rain in the middle of summer, unexpected, unwelcome, and soaked in something that smelled too much like regret to be washed away by time alone. Mabel didn't flinch, didn't look away, but she felt her spine stiffen slightly, the way it used to when she braced for bad news in wartime telegrams or hospital waiting rooms, not because she feared it, but because she knew she'd have to carry it. Clara moved carefully toward her, one hand gripping the cane, the other reaching into the folds of her coat until she pulled out a photograph, dog-eared and faded, as if its edges had been touched too many times by trembling hands hoping for a different past. She handed it to Mabel without a word, and there he was, the boy who once trembled behind pantry doors during thunderstorms, eyes wide with fear and lips mouthing prayers he never spoke aloud. Only now he was grown, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a polished suit with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and a handshake that, Mabel could feel even through the image, had become too firm to trust. Elliot, Mabel whispered, more to herself than to Clara, the name tasting both sweet and bitter, like a forgotten lullaby hummed in the wrong key. He worshipped you, Clara said gently, sitting beside her now as if neither of them could quite face the weight of the truth alone. Watched your every move, hung on your every word, tried so hard to be brave because you told him he could be. Mabel's eyes never left the photo, but her fingers curled slowly around its edges as if trying to protect a memory that was already breaking. He left the town after high school, Clara continued, went off with a scholarship and came back 10 years later with a new name, a new job, and a new mission. Mabel looked up, her voice quiet but sharpened by the edge of betrayal. What mission? Clara's answer came with a sigh that felt too old for her lungs, too familiar in its sadness to be mistaken for anything else. To reshape the town, she said, to modernize it, reorganize it, strip it down to something clean, profitable, and manageable. Mabel closed her eyes, and for a moment she could see it, the meetings, the signatures, the quiet reshuffling of funds, the fading of names on plaques and doors, until nothing was left but a clean slate with Elliot's signature at the bottom. He dismantled everything, Clara said, not with malice, but with cold precision. He believed he was correcting your mistakes. The words cut deep, not because they were unfair, but because part of her remembered how hard it had been to say no to every need, every plea, every trembling child who'd asked to stay just one more night. He took Harold under his wing, Clara added, used him like a foot in the door, let him carry the whispers until no one could tell where the truth ended and the ambition began. Mabel didn't speak right away, because some truths don't need immediate reaction, they need time to settle into the heart like a stone dropped into a still lake, one ripple at a time. I taught him to be brave, she said finally, her voice soft and thick with grief, but I never taught him what to do with power. Clara nodded slowly, her hand now resting gently atop Mabel's as if to remind her that guilt, while heavy, didn't have to be carried alone. Outside the theater, the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves like 1,000 quiet voices trying to find their way back home. As the old dog stood by the doorway, ever silent, ever waiting, Mabel looked toward the exit and asked, her voice steadier now. Is he the reason the records disappeared? From the back of the theater, where no light touched the farthest rows, came a gravelly voice, low, rough, and wrapped in secrets too long held. No, it said, that part, that was me. The voice drifted out from the dark like a forgotten wind blowing through a broken attic window, rough, low, full of gravel and guilt, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard, because it carried the undeniable weight of a man who'd lived with what he'd done for far too long. Mabel stood still, her shoulders tense but her feet rooted, and for a brief second, she wondered if she had the strength to hear one more betrayal, one more truth twisted into something too ugly to forgive. From the shadows stepped a man she hadn't seen in years, not because he had left town, but because he'd mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight, always behind the counter, always beneath the radar, always just another quiet fixture in a town that forgot its own heroes too quickly. Charlie, Mabel said, the name falling from her lips like dust shaken off an old Bible, not spoken in anger, not quite in sorrow, but in that heavy tone reserved for people who once mattered more than they deserved. He nodded, his cap in his hands, his eyes not quite meeting hers, and he moved with the slow shame of someone who still walked with ghosts tied to his ankles. I was the one who kept the records, he said, not to boast, but to confess, names, photos, birthdays, medical histories, everything you filed, everything you fought to protect when no one else believed those children had a right to be remembered. Mabel's heart twisted, the image of her young self flashing through her mind, hunched at the kitchen table late at night, scribbling notes in neat cursive, sorting donations, tracking supplies, because no one else would. I locked them up, Charlie continued, voice cracking now like old floorboards under winter boots, kept them hidden when the heat started coming down from the council, figured if they couldn't see what you built, they couldn't tear it apart. Mabel closed her eyes, her breath thick with the bitter tang of almost forgiveness, because she understood the logic, even as she loathed the outcome. You thought hiding the truth would protect it, she said, her voice low and steady, but all it did was erase the people we swore would never be forgotten. Charlie nodded once, sharp and deep, like a man taking a punch he knew he deserved. They were just papers, he muttered, but when I burned them. God help me, I knew they weren't just papers anymore. Clara placed a hand on Mabel's shoulder then, and the old dog padded closer, sitting beside them like a silent judge who'd seen too much and decided to love anyway. They trusted us, Mabel whispered, and we all let them down in different ways. Charlie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his voice barely more than a breath now. I never told you this, he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small, scorched metal tin, but one folder survived, just one. He handed it to her like it was a holy relic, and when she opened it, the pages inside were fragile but intact, birth certificates, school reports, drawings in crayon, little hearts drawn in the corners. And at the top, written in her own hand, was the name Daniel West, followed by the word severe anxiety, afraid of storms, gifted in music. She stared at the name, and slowly, painfully, the pieces began to fit. The boy from the pantry. The name Elliot used in the city. A past scrubbed clean. A future built on silence. And just as the truth began to rise like fire in her chest, Charlie looked her in the eyes and asked the only question that still mattered. Do you remember what happened, the night he ran away? From the doorway, where the rain had begun to fall in slow, steady rhythm, the dog let out a soft whimper, and a woman's voice, trembling but clear, answered. Yes, because I was the reason he ran. The voice belonged to someone Mabel had once known so well that silence between them had often said more than words ever could, and yet now, after all this time, it took her a moment to recognize the face beneath the hood, half wet with rain and memory. There she stood, Sarah Green, the girl from the back hallway, the late-night whisperer, the one who, decades ago, had slipped through Mabel's boarding house like smoke through a keyhole, unnoticed by many but never unseen by Mabel. She stepped into the old theater slowly, her hands clasped together in front of her as if she were holding something fragile, or maybe just trying to keep herself from shaking. Mabel said nothing, not out of judgment, but because she understood that some truths demand a space bigger than words, a silence where grief can unfold without shame. I was 16, Sarah began, her voice wrapped in rust and years, and I had nowhere else to go, no family, no plan, just a violin case and a lie I wasn't ready to stop telling. The dog walked to her, sniffed the hem of her coat, and sat down beside her, quiet, calm, as if recognizing something in her scent that had lingered in the boarding house walls all these years. Elliot was younger than me, but sharp, always watching, always listening, and one night, when I was crying over a letter I'd never meant for anyone to see, he heard everything. She paused, eyes glancing at Mabel like a child waiting for the scolding that never came, but Mabel's face stayed soft, not because the truth didn't sting, but because judgment had no place in the face of confession. He told me he was going to tell you, Sarah said, her voice breaking now like glass under a tired hand, said you deserved to know that I wasn't who I claimed to be, that I'd stolen the name of another girl to escape something I didn't have words for yet. Charlie and Clara stayed still, each one a witness to a story unraveling at last, threads long buried now being pulled free with painful grace. I panicked, Sarah whispered, told him if he said anything, I'd say he'd hurt me. I told him no one would believe him over me, not after what he'd been through. Mabel felt her breath catch, not in anger, not even in sorrow, but in that hollow space where maternal instinct lives, the aching knowledge that even your best intentions can become blind spots. I didn't mean it, Sarah said, tears running now down her cheeks unchecked, but he ran, and he never came back. A silence fell again, deeper now, complete, and Mabel walked forward, one step at a time, like each pace was measured against decades of loss, of forgetting, of remembering too late. You both were just children, she said, voice steady but low, and I should have seen it. I should have known. Sarah shook her head, but Mabel raised her hand gently, silencing the apology before it could be spoken. It wasn't your lie that ruined him, Mabel said, looking toward the burned tin in Charlie's hands, it was mine, the one I told myself every day, that I could save them all. And there it was, the truth, laid bare like old lumber beneath peeling paint, that even kindness, when stretched too far, begins to fray. Mabel turned to face them all now, Clara, Charlie, Sarah, even the dog, and in her eyes burned something not quite sadness and not quite peace, but that rarest kind of fire, earned clarity. I forgot my life, she said softly, because some part of me wanted to forget, not the love, not the work, but the failures, the cracks. Clara stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Mabel's shoulders like a sister long estranged but never unloved. "But you didn't forget," she whispered, "not really, you just carried it all so long, it started to carry you." And in that moment, as the theater lights flickered with a ghost of old electricity, something shifted inside Mabel, not just memory returning, but forgiveness rising from the ashes of years too quiet. Then the dog stood, walked to the exit, and turned back, not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows the final chapter is waiting just one step ahead. Mabel looked to Sarah, to Charlie, to Clara, and finally to the folder in her hands. "Where is Elliot now?" she asked. And from the lobby, voice deep, calm, and unmistakably familiar, came the final words of the journey. "I've been waiting for you, Mabel, and I remember everything." Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.